Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video, and this week it's time to talk about wings. Let's get into it.
The strict technomancer that is Vincey V. Let us get to the technique and learn it, Vincey V.
No, we're not talking about the excellent sitcom from the 90s starring Tony Shalhoub. In fact, we're talking about feathered wings on my knight here. Now, previously you saw this guy in the Ultimate Guide to Non-Metallic Metal, but of course there is a significant part of this guy that doesn't have any metal on him, specifically his wings. So today I'm going to show you a way to sort of paint wings to make them a little more iridescent, brighter, and yet still capture the feathered nature of them. So let's head over to the desk, let's get painting. Now, these wings are just painted in black because I was doing a lot of NMM, so I didn't want a zenithal or anything like that. So as a result, we're going to need to start by turning these a color. I do want these to be somewhat angelic, but as you'll see, we're going to use a very interesting set of paints here. And these colors that I'm using might seem a bit strange to you, but trust me, they'll all have a purpose. So we begin by just taking a big fat dry brush, and I go heavily into my blue here, my very light blue, and I'm just going to basically stipple on, or heavy dry brush, or whatever you want to call it, some of this blue to cover over the black. It takes me about 2 passes because this is very light, but it isn't really that hard. There's no skill to this, it's just taking a big brush and jamming some paint onto the surface. After 2 coats working my way around the wings, we're in a perfectly good place and ready to go. Now I started with the blue because generally that's going to give a more cold feeling in line with the figure, but also because it's just going to create visual interest. One of the things when you're working with feathered wings is you do want to work in colors. Like all times we're talking about working in things that are black or white, we want to try to incorporate hues, something on the color wheel, as often as possible. So blue is going to be our underlying shade. You'll see how it all works out. Okay. Once that's sort of good to go, my next step is I'm going to take some heavy white. Okay, so this is a heavy body acrylic. And I'm going to take a chunk of it and thin it way down. So I put basically 8 drops of sort of surfactant or flow improver, whatever you want to call it, to about one sort of amount of paint, whatever. It's very thin with a lot of surfactant. And so it runs into all the recesses. Effectively, I'm sort of making kind of a wash out of a really, really intense, heavily pigmented white. And I am then going to run that under each level change of the feathers. So you can see how I'm placing it under, like where each layer of feathers stacks on top, like the shingles on a roof of the next layer. That's where I'm putting the white. Those would normally be recesses and often be dark, but with these wings and often with sometimes natural creatures as well, they have lighter colors in the upper parts of their feathers and darker elements as you get to the bottoms of their feathers. You'll see this a lot with tropical birds, but it's also just a cool way to do sort of angelic feathers to give them a more iridescent glowing look. I focus that mostly on the inner parts of the wings, so as you get out toward the end, there's just less overlap because each individual feathers are getting bigger, but also because I want more of that white gathered near that center area. Okay. Once that's done, and I have that in place, it is looking thoroughly goofy. And I'm sure at this point in the tutorial, you're looking at me like, what, Vince, are you doing? I have made a mistake by clicking this video, but trust me, stay with me. By the end, this is going to look ripping. So, next up, I take some of my faded greens. This isn't my lightest green. I have kind of 2 greenish tones. Again, using something that has a little bit of hue to it. And the green might seem an odd choice, but it was the same color that I used in a lot of the highlights of the armor. So it will create a more universal highlight and make the figure appear as though the wings are in the same light as the armor itself. So I then begin the thin lines. And really, this is the key to feathered wings. It is lots of repeated thin lines. So I start by tracing the little center part of the feather, which has a name. It's the little stick in the middle of the feather. I don't know what it's called. It has a name. Could I have looked it up before I started this video? Yep. Did I? Nope. Here we go. So anyways, I trace the line down the center of the feather. I then, on each of the feathers, begin tracing lines out. Now you'll notice I'm mostly working towards the white. I'm sort of bridging that initial area here. Okay? And I'm doing that because I want to create a transition of the light. So from the pure white, where I've started in the recesses, I then begin tracing out that line and doing some nice thin lines. Okay, so just kind of getting those all in place. And really, this is a very simple, albeit extremely time-consuming process. So I work my way down all of the feathers, focusing more passes. So I'm covering the whole feather with the lines, getting rid of a lot of the blue. This base green is going to be my sort of key tone. And then you'll see I'm still leaving a little bit of blue here and there in the recesses, in between the feathers, things like that, to act as an interesting sort of shade color. That's a very bright blue, but in this case, it's going to almost act as a shade. And I'm just working down the feather, doing lots of thin lines in a outward direction, so it looks like I'm creating the texture of the feathers. Now, sometimes you'll get figures that are very heavily textured, to the point where each of these little individual strands of the feather are like really well present on the figure. If that's the case, you can kind of do the same thing through a dry brush. This one didn't quite have that level of detail, so I'm reinforcing what's already minorly there by tracing the lines. So you can do a little mix of the two. The more heavily detailed the figure is, the more textured it is, the more you can just rely on kind of dry brushing to do this step. But cover all the wings, front and back, top to bottom, connecting to the white. Now, importantly, I do not cover all of the white. I overlap the white, but I do not cover all of it. I want that white to stay in there. Okay, great. So we got that. Our next step is we're going to do, this is my only airbrush step. You wouldn't have to do this through airbrushing, it's just faster. I take a little bit of white ink, and I want to bridge the transition. When I did that white with the brush and shoved it into the recesses, it's really stark in how it transitions. So we're going to use an airbrush to very quickly glaze with white. You can do it with a brush, but glazing very light white colors are just easier with an airbrush. So once again, I take that ink, thin it way down. So this is probably like 4 or 5 drops of thinner, at least to 1 drop of ink. And I'm then going to very lightly spray. This is, of course, using my hard-earned Steenbeck right here. And so it's got a 0.2 needle in it. And you can see I'm just effectively fuzzing the edge of all of those white areas, kind of tracing along them, making it so it looks like the white and then the faded green. And where those two colors come together, that's where I place the band of gentle white glaze. That then helps smooth that transition from the intense white we laid down with the brush to the faded green, which is also a very bright color and is and shows more of the actual texture of the feather. This presents a really nice glow and sort of ambience. It sets up that intense tone in those deep recesses of the feathers, gives that iridescent glowing effect. Now keep in mind, if I was going to do something like a tropical bird, where it's probably bright yellow or something tucked into there, I could do this same exact process. I would just come back in with a yellow ink afterwards and cover that whole area. So no problem, easy peasy, lemon squeezy. You can build into those colors and those bright centers. The key is to get that white underneath it so it really pops and shows. Okay, once that's in place, my next step is to take some of my green-gray, which is my very near white, grayish-greenish color, and now I'm going to trace the lines just at the top to further reinforce and connect the faded green up into the white. This is actually pretty minimal work. Now here, I'm only working at the heart, at those deep recesses. Think of it like the internal part of the feather, right? Where layer A sits over top of layer B, I'm putting it on B just in that white area. Doing some more lines, but yet again, it's the same. The trick with feathers is just the line down the center and then lots of little hashy, scratchy lines going in a straight line down the feather, tilted somewhat toward the end of the feather. That's it, right? Nothing more complicated. So it's a 45-degree angle, basically, or something like that, tilted towards the outside tip of the feather. I work those just in those central areas to, again, help bridge that difference between the faded green and the pure white, creating more visual noise, but also a more interesting color transition. Because I'm working so much with these colors of greens and blues and so on, it provides me for much more visual interest than if I was just trying to do this all with white and gray. That is boring. And in fact, if you look at a lot of classical, like old masters painting of angels, which were often featured, they weren't using just white and gray and black. They oftentimes had other hues mixed in there to capture the environmental light that's present around the figure. Okay, we're almost done now. The next step I do is, because we're working from light out to dark, I need to darken the wingtips. So here I'm going to take some of my mid-gray, in this case it's a graphite, and I'm going to just dry brush the outer tips of the wings. So I start by just working a lot of paint off onto my little mechanics towel here. And once I have barely any paint left, I test on the back of my hand and then apply to the feathers. What I'm going to get is this nice transition out into darkness. I start on the very tip of the wing and then work in. So I get this nice gray darker tone on the outsides of the wings, and then I move into the lighter tone. And because I can use the dry brush to blend, because I have so little paint left, I just work it. It creates a nice natural transition with no additional work necessary. However, what is this channel except for additional work necessary? I then take the same gray and come in, and in that area, and especially the bridge between where I dry brush and the faded green, I then do some light thin lines with the gray. So to help bridge that together, kind of again, where the faded green and the gray touch, that's where I focus a lot of my thin lines. Again, all the feathers is just these thin hash lines. So that then helps both smooth any areas that were rough from the dry brush, but it also helps me fade that transition in and look natural through the use of the texture where the light would be capturing the darker parts, the grayer parts of the feathers towards the tips. Okay, last step is I'm going to take something like a black and just, something pretty dark. And in this case, this is from the new John Blanche set. And I am going to then, again, work it onto my dry brush, work most of it off. Again, working this very hard until there is extremely little paint left in my mechanics towel. And I then very lightly dry brush just the outer tips of the wings, okay, to get that nice black natural tip. A lot of natural creatures have those dark tips on the edges of their wings. That's what this captures. So even though we're dealing with something theoretically angelic here with the knight, the making the wings feel more like real-world credible wings makes the entire figure feel more real, even when dealing with fantastical subjects. So very light dry brushes just around the edge. I then come in, same thing as before, with the black, and with a thinned down version of it, create a few lines over the gray, where the gray and the black meet, to then create additional transition and texture where the black is catching the little feather pieces. I'm sure someone in the comments below, by the way, who knows about birds is going to tell me all the names of these wing parts. I appreciate it. Please do. I doubt I'll remember it. But if you know the wing parts, drop them down below. So at any rate, when that's done, if you have any challenges, you can always go back and very, very, very lightly dry brush with the gray again to kind of smooth that transition, but not strictly necessary. With all of that in place, my wings are ready to go. So here's how the figure came out. I think he looks pretty awesome. As I said, you could adapt this to any kind of feathered wings you want, whether it be a tropical bird or some giant magical sorcerer of Tzeentch. It really doesn't matter. This kind of trick of moving from the light to the dark is very easy. The key is to work in your white, and then you can always just color tone it with anything you want, be it from yellow to pink down into the other colors. Remember, expressing through those hashy thin lines, it is a laborious process, but there's also a zen to it, and it will create that credibility in your feathers. All right, with that done, I will say thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. This figure was really fun to paint, and now he can go into my shelf. But if you've got any questions, drop them down below. I always answer every question asked on the channel. Hey, if you liked this, give it a like. Subscribe for additional hobby cheating in the future. We have new videos here every Saturday. If you want to support the channel, if you find these tutorials valuable, I really appreciate that. There are affiliate links down below, including our new link with Michigan Toy Soldier. All of those links don't cost you anything extra. In fact, they often save you money. You can get 5-10% off depending on which link you're using. And it really, really does help support the channel. So I thank you so much for using that. There's also, of course, the games down there I make with Uncle Adam. Our newest game will be coming very soon. And there's also our Patreon, focused on review and feedback and taking your next step on your hobby journey. We'd love to have you as part of the community. Thank you so much, though, for watching this one. I really appreciate it. And as always, we'll see you next time.